Hello, everyone. A very good morning to those who are joining us from Singapore and Asia, and good afternoon or good evening to all of you joining us from other parts of the world. Thank you for being here with us for today's online event on Explainable AI in Finance presented by SG Innovate. My name is Jin from SG Innovate, and as a Singapore government-backed investor, we have been building up and driving deep tech innovations in AI, healthcare, quantum tech, and autonomous technologies across various industries. Over the past couple of years, as we invest in startups, build talent, work with scientists and researchers across various fields, we also realize that it is important to connect Singapore with the global R&D ecosystem to learn how we can better harness technologies for next generation intelligence and decision making. So in today's session, our panel of global thought leaders will be discussing why research in the field of explainable AI is so crucial in helping us understand the rationale behind AI decision-making, specifically for the finance industry. We encourage you to engage with our speakers during the session by submitting your questions in the Q&A box located on the lower panel of your screen. So without further ado, I would like to invite our moderator for this session, Sanjana, to start us off. Sanjana, please. Sanjana, I think you are muted.
Well, I hope that's the only technology glitch we have happens this morning. But thanks, Jinsam. And I was very fascinated seeing all the work that SG Innovate is doing to sort of bring to the fore the talent that we have in Singapore and being in a position to solve for such challenges. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sanjana, and today I'm tasked to sort of not just talk about something which is very industry relevant, but it's sort of a personal passion area for me as well. By way of background, I currently head Refinitiv Labs based here in Singapore. And for those of you who might not be aware, Refinitiv is the erstwhile financial and risk division of Thomson Reuters. And much of our business is about providing market data and financial infrastructure to the capital market operators. By way of my day job, I end up being very up close and personal with a variety of AI applications. And you guys, given that you're attending the session, are sort of aware how prevalent AI applications are becoming, in the world of finance, be it millions of, buying and selling millions dollars worth of instrument on a daily basis, assigning credit scores, clearing insurance claims, and also helping in portfolio management and wide areas in that world. As these sort of things become more prevalent and we're seeing far more successes, I'm also seeing that over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of asks and pressures around wanting to understand whether we are thinking about AI in the right way. A variety of think tanks and regulators have come together to even understand how might we drive more explainability in AI. It's always perceived to be this big black box. So this topic, in some way, if you sort of think about relating it with a movie, I always think about the Superman saying where with great power comes great responsibility. And somewhere along the lines, we are at a point wherein whilst we started to derive great power out of AI, we got to have these conversations and get our head around what's the best way to tackle this. I don't think I would have had a better panel to discuss this. They're very diverse and they've had wide variety of experience in the space of AI. So I'd love to sort of, dive right into it and probably start by inviting my panel to introduce themselves and the work they've been doing in the space to kick us off. And we'll sort of hope to have a very engaging conversation after that. Probably Shonali, if you wanted to kick us off with an introduction, that might be great.
Thanks, Sanjana. Thanks everyone for this opportunity and for a very good morning to all as well. So by way of background, I'm Shonali and I am the CTO of IDA Technologies. IDA is a startup and we are a machine learning startup and we focus on delivering products and solutions to primarily insurance and to some banking as well. So my background is that I was an academic for the longest time in my career. I used to be a professor of computer science at Monash University in Australia. I then moved to Singapore about 9 years ago now. It feels like yesterday. But I've been here, I moved here to join A-Star. And since it's a Singapore audience, I think everyone knows A-Star is the Agency for Science, Technology and Research, the Singapore government's national R&D agency. And in one of the institutes, I used to lead the data science research department. So I think this was a very exciting time around 2011-12, where we had something like about 50 to 70, data scientists, probably at that time, maybe the largest concentration of machine learning PhDs in Singapore. And, it was a very exciting time. We did a lot of work working with not just banks and insurance, but with a large number of industry partners, showing the power and potential of machine learning. And that was the inspiration to start IDA. The IDA journey began about 4 years ago now. So it's been 4 years since we've been doing this. And primarily what we do is we deliver what we call, the mainstay of what we do is insurance claims. And health insurance is really our focus. So we have a lot of our solutions actually running live today in Singapore with large insurers, where the AI or the machine learning engines are making the decisions for processing of health claims, right? So this is very, it's very exciting for me to see this journey from, idea. I saw this, from idea to application, to see it running. And that's where we are today. So we are about 40 people. We deliver solutions to tier 1 and tier 2 banks and insurance in the ASEAN region, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, etc. That's where we're at. So that's a brief introduction to me, and I'll pass the baton back to Sanjana now. Thank you, Sanjana.
Thanks. David, did you want to carry through?
Delightfully. Just had to make sure I take off the mute button. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. So David Hardoon, I'll try and keep it a very brief introductions, just collectively consider myself as just a geek of data. Specifically in the whole field of, fairness, explainability, AI, I guess it's a bit of a coming home to me, having been involved in the last 3 years as a regulator, although I never considered myself a regulator, but within the regulator, really thinking about the principle guidelines that ought to be in place from an industry perspective, beyond just the application. Now back to the industry, working in Union Bank of the Philippines, one of the most advanced digital banks around, pushing digitalization. But perhaps in a more serious note, the relevance is now seeing how to truly make sure that these kind of safeguards and considerations of explainability, fairness, and so forth are embedded as part of that journey and process of digitalization, data science, and AI. So in brief and in short, other than that, just massive data geek.
Manuel, thank you, David.
Thank you. Hi. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, SG Innovate, for organizing this. Nice to see some people I know. Nice to meet the others. So Manuel Morales. Where do I come in all of this? I'm originally a researcher, right, from the beginning. So I've been a researcher, professor at the University of Montreal for the past 16 years in the math department. Originally doing research in statistical learning, statistical applications, data science in insurance and finance. And I did that for maybe the first, I did that very academically for the first 10 years of my career. Then I began a journey of transitioning between academia and industry. I began doing a lot of collaborative research projects with different institutions in Montreal. I'm based in Montreal. Actually, over here, it's you're in my future right now. You're like tomorrow morning. I'm here Tuesday night. So that's in Montreal. And I collaborated with several banks on different projects that began to take more and more ambitious scopes. And that happened when somehow Montreal found itself as being a center of innovation in artificial intelligence. Many of my colleagues were behind that drive here in the computer science. And that changed the ecosystem, right? So the ecosystem started looking for researchers doing this kind of applications. So that's why I started to get closer and closer to the industry until a little bit over 2 years ago, National Bank of Canada, they invited me to join their initiative of transformation using artificial intelligence. And so I was working with them for the past 2 years as the chief AI scientist in that initiative. I had a lot of fun. It was very interesting what things we were doing. And so that gave me a few different perspectives, right? Perspective as a researcher, pure researcher, perspective as an applied researcher trying to do technology transfer within the industry. And then finally, somebody who was helping and orchestrating digital transformation using AI. And one of the challenges that we were facing while at National Bank was exactly setting up governance, because when you are trying to deploy artificial intelligence solutions, then that takes you to that reflection where you have to start thinking about explaining things and setting up the governance, right? Like the policy that is going to regulate this. So that in a nutshell, that's my journey. I met David somewhere down that road, and that's how I got involved into this type of discussions, governance, explainability, fairness, bias, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks.
We all met David somewhere down that road, haven't we, David?
David, you've been on the road quite a bit.
I feel like I need to apologize.
Not quite. We've all had great interactions along that journey and road. So yeah, no, thanks for keeping that flame alive. So guys, I mean, I know that we've all in our roles been, at this for a while now. And I think all our experiences are also talking in very direct ways in the world of financial services. Even before we, start to sort of get our heads around, the do's and the don'ts, or where it's succeeding or not from an explainability side. I love to be in a position to get your views on how do we really think about explainability, right? A lot of people talk about it from the concept of it being, let's drive more rationale into what AI is doing. It's sort of in some ways also becoming synonymous with the fairness and bias and, areas such as that. It might be a good idea to just hear from each of you as to how are you guys thinking about explainability, because it can be really wide. And any one of you can kick us off with that. I mean, I know that you all have a different perspective, which would be good to have. David, did you want to kick us off on this?
Sure. No, absolutely. I'm kind of half sighing because I've kind of gone through my own little turmoil about thinking and understanding and kind of approaching the whole aspect of explainability. And in a way, also kind of taking this journey from academia, I guess consultancy, to being in-house and regulator to industry. And the one thing that I've kind of realized is that, and maybe perhaps again, I apologize for that, but let me stop being a bit of a Grinch, is that I don't think we truly understand what we actually mean when we say explainability. And what I mean by that is I believe we all mean well. I believe there is a good intention and an objective to prevent, obviously, risks from occurring, obviously to prevent discrimination, so forth and so forth. But that's on an abstract, it's on a high level. But when you actually start going into the mathematical, the technical, the pragmatic details of it, what does explainability actually mean? What does opening the black box mean specifically? And to something that you've alluded to earlier, a lot of the work that you've seen have, not that anything wrong with it, but a lot of the work that you kind of see out there has intermingled explainability with fairness. Yeah. Now, to say that is, if you think about it, I can be perfectly explainable and I can build algorithms that has the degree of explainability necessary, but they're unfair. I can have perfect fairness, but from algorithms or methodologies that are in principle unexplainable. So this is why I want to mention this. I mean, without going into obviously the technical details of it, but it's kind of put me in a position where I've kind of realized that necessity to first and foremost understand who needs that degree of explainability, and therefore what extent and what is the explainability in the context. And the second one, making this very difficult, in my personal view, mental split between the fairness that we're drawn into and the explainability, realizing that actually they're not the same thing.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating, right? Because, and I know Shonali, you mentioned this to me before as well, that you also like to think about this in two separate categories. And I wonder, in your experience as somebody who's implementing this in a wide variety of institutions, how are you trying to think about, this segment? Is this something which is more and more, do you see a lineage towards a certain type of explainability, or do you think people are still just trying to get their heads around, I just need to understand what this thing is doing?
I think it's the latter, to start off with the last question. I mean, I think it really means a lot of things to different people, and it really depends on the context that each person is approaching the AI application. It's also very, I think, application specific, in the sense that depending on what it is that you're trying to do, there are different stakeholders who want different things from the AI systems that are coming into fruition and being put into place. Personally, I mean, as a researcher, I think that the very broad, general, explainable AI from being able to explain exactly all the deep mathematics that's happening inside an algorithm, I think it's still very early days. I don't think we have managed to unravel how this entire decision process is happening, right? I think a lot of researchers are working in this area. One of the research topics that's really quite close to my heart is trying to actually put in a lot more semantics and domain knowledge into an AI algorithm rather than just having it learn from data. Because if you can learn from the context, the semantics that exists in the domain along with the data, then potentially that's one step forward from a research standpoint towards having more explainable decisions, right? Because it's got the context. But for today, I think we are really very data driven. So that's just in the realm of research. For me, there are two aspects to it. One is, how is the decision being made? And the other is why the decision is being made. So all that I spoke about previously was how the algorithm works. I think that's one aspect of explainability, certainly. But I think from deploying AI systems, at least this is what I strongly believe in, the key is why is a decision being made? I think that part is what actually the users of AI systems today, be it banks, be it insurers, be it any other regulated or non-regulated application, the user needs to understand, why did this machine say that this person should be given a loan? Why did this machine say that this claim should be approved, right? I think that is the distinction that I like to make. And I think we are making a lot of progress in the why. I think today we have maybe not a generic framework for extracting the why for every possible application, but for specific applications, we are able to explain, get the why out of the system. And that's why we are in a position where we can actually deploy these things and see it running.
Yeah, I do want to come back to you at some point on understanding how we can do, better explainability on the whys and what are you seeing as working. But Manuel, over to you.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a very interesting question. I agree with David when he says that it means many things to different people, and that after trying to answer the question to many different people that have asked the question, you are not sure anymore if you understand. But having had the journey that I just described, that gave me the opportunity to actually evolve my own perspective on that. So I started as a researcher doing applications and always being confronted at some point with business people asking me questions regarding the outcomes of those models, trying to explain what would that mean, and always being challenged on the technical side of things, trying to, okay, so what does he mean? And that that always translates into technicalities, right? So how can I make that this outcome can be somehow explained in terms of the inner workings of the model, right? And that kind of question depended a lot on who I was talking to, right? It wouldn't be the same type of question if it was the guy who has to explain that to the decision making budget wise, or if it was to somebody who is concerned with regulatory aspects. So, but at the end of the day, as a data scientist, for me, it always meant at that point, it always meant tweaking the mathematical workings of my model to answer that question. So that's one part of it. But then as I started taking a step back and trying to see it as the big picture, right? So we're trying to develop solutions, come up with innovative ways of doing things and transforming processes within an institution. That changed a little bit my perspective on this, right? Because then it became more about building trust, right? Why do I need to explain things? It's because I wanna build trust, and here I always like to think about analogies, like in the aviation industry, right? They've been doing this for maybe over 100 years, building planes, making sure that the plane flies and that nobody dies, right? And that over 100 years, that implied building like a whole system that would look at all the moving parts and making sure that every single component works, right? So working at the bank, that made me see explainability through that lens, right? Now we have to explain all those little moving parts, and that means explaining that to different people. One example, for instance, when I'm building a plane and I'm trying to look at how efficient the how do you call that, like the rafts, you know, when you land on water, you have to build those things so that people can escape with the plane, right? You want to make sure that component it's working properly. To explain that component is working properly, you do not need to know the mechanics of how a plane flies, right? So there's different context to what you want to explain, and then at the end of the day, you're building trust through assisting with policy, right? Your explanation somehow has to assist and help and augment the policy the policy that gives the context to your operation. In banking, that means sometimes regulation, third-party regulation, but that can also mean your internal mechanisms through which you make sure that your solutions or your deployments are compliant, right? So to finish answer that question, so explainability to me meant different things through my career, and now the way I see it is, it's how you can make sure that you have the right tools and components to explain at the different levels of our governance framework, right?
Yeah.
Sanjay, can I just jump in here? And I just wanted to add one very small point on top of, the points mentioned earlier, is I think also context is extremely important. And I'll give you two illustrations of that particular aspect of the context. I was having a dinner debate with someone who was talking about the fact that neural networks is unexplainable. And I said, well, actually, no, that's not technically correct. I can explain it to you. That doesn't necessarily mean you will understand what I'm explaining. Again, I know how arrogant that may sound, but it is the context associated with it. So when we also think about this from a business application point of view, and this is what I meant by I don't think we've actually figured out what explainable means, especially when we think about legal aspects of it, is what is the smell test of explainable? So if, for example, you say to me, David, I need to explain this. Okay, I explained it. Check the box.
Yeah.
But you may go, well, I didn't understand anything about that. So that's number one. Number two, and this one, I'll let the professors correct me if I'm completely wrong on this one. But if you think about the origin, if you really, really roll back the clock all the way towards, the narrative between the narrative and artificial intelligence and the creation behind it, it was really about mimicking us, mimicking our brain. So in a way, when we're asking, and again, I know I'm giving you an extreme, but still think about this. When we're saying, explain to me an AI algorithm, or it's literally explain to me the neural network, what you're saying to a human isn't don't explain to me how you've arrived at a conclusion. Explain to me how the neurons in your brain fired in that particular sequence that have resulted in you coming to that decision.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's the context.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. That's a subtlety, right? You have to explain, but to what degree? Well, to the same degree that you would explain that in that same context to somebody, right?
I mean, and if you think about the example of, loan officers, and we talk about if we had an AI engine which was automating loan decisions or credit decisions, we got to bear in mind about fairness and all the variety of things. And this is sort of segueing into my next question of sorts, is that in a lot of way, and there are two schools of thoughts, right? A lot of people feel like we are really trying to restrain AI by trying to put as many asks of it at this stage. Meaning, are we putting that extra stress on it to explain things which we typically would not expect a human being to explain? Which brings me to my actual question, is that are there scenarios specifically from a use case standpoint or from an application standpoint where we should really care about explainability a lot more than, just saying that for every place where we are using AI, it needs to be ticking, David, those 3 boxes or 5 boxes or 10, whatever people might lay it out to be. So are you guys sort of, in your experiencing, finding that maybe explainability needs to work to a higher degree of efficacy in a certain subset of applications? Or what are your views on this? Shonali, did you want to take this? And then
I just want to say something to David, only because I like to argue with David. That's like something that we do on panels. But David, we don't really ask the loan officer to tell us which neuron fired in their brain. We only ask them, why did you reject this application? So I think I would rather take the standpoint that we should hold AI accountable to the same degree that we hold human beings accountable, right? We ask them, why did you do this? And I think that's really what we should be asking AI systems that are supporting, assisting, augmenting, human beings in those contexts. But I think, Sanjana, I really, also to Manuel's point and to your question, I think it's a spectrum, right? It's a range. So we go from, places like Boeing and Airbus, the aerospace industry, which are so regulated that people have to actually sign personal indemnity. You're personally liable, So you're literally not saying that, this is not something that I'm responsible for. To places in financial services where highly regulated as well, but maybe people don't sign, maybe people who are approving loans don't actually sign personal indemnities, right? To other areas which are like social media, really, in this case, if Facebook had an ad recommendation engine and I get an ad which offers me an Australian PR, not knowing that I have an Australian passport, it hardly matters, right? It's not the end of the world. So I think it's a spectrum. And I think where there are risks, where there are disadvantages to people that can happen as a result of AI decision making, then I think there we do need to have a much more responsibility, much more onus on having, degrees of explainability. Why did this decision get made? What was the reasoning, the rationale for that? So I think that's my kind of take, that it's a spectrum, and that depending on where we are operating in this spectrum and what is the risks, the impact to a section of society or people, then I think the responsibility is a lot more. Does that sort of give you, I guess?
No, it makes sense. It's more about where there are elements of denying something on the back of some data being fed. You want to be in a position to make sure that, I agree, Shonali. David, just put your, hat from a year or so ago. How are regulators thinking about this from an explainability standpoint? Meaning, is there areas where, we got to be more conscious from a regulatory perspective?
Okay, well, obviously saying this from a personal point of view now, I think regulators are really coming to grips with it, and I'll say why. Because a regular approach from a regulatory point of view is really putting in place, the policies, high-level requirements, and kind of allowing for interpretability by financial institutions. I mean, a lot of times some of the complaints are. And this is exactly where the problem is and where regulators are trying to find that balance. I'll give you an example. Denmark's recent legislation requirement, where all algorithms need to have explainability by design. Now, that, to me, would kill AI innovation. And not by saying that I don't believe you shouldn't have those requirements, but by saying that, now you have people on the ground going, well, what does that mean? In what context? So what is the safest choice when you're looking at an industry which is heavily regulated? Do nothing. That is the safest choice. So so I think what you're finding now, and you're seeing a lot of it, in Canada, France, Thailand, Hong Kong, London, Singapore, regulators are coming out with this alternative approach rather than straight out saying this is regulation, this is the law. Here are guidelines, here are principles, here's ways in which we're thinking about finding that middle ground effectively. And it's working in collaboration with the industry because we're really figuring things out. And I just wanted to add something on top of Shonali's question, and actually something you were saying earlier, is one of the reasons I think we're reacting this way is it's the speed in which this is happening. Because if you think about it, this is no difference from the great example from Manuel in terms of the transportation industry. If I bring it to the cars, let's be honest, how many of us really understand and can really explain to detail how a Tesla works? I know the rough principles, but why am I okay with it? Well, we've had, literally 120 years, more or less, to go through that process and coming to the comfort. So I have trust that if, God forbid, something goes wrong, however disastrous it may be, there is someone in that supply chain who is able to explain at that relevant level what has happened. And even if you put the insurance hat on, something that truly could never be anticipated or explained, you have the God clause or whatever, act of God. But there's that trust. With AI, it was, boom, we can predict everything. And it's like, wait, hold on a second, take a step back. What do you mean? How? What? So there's a lot of that kind of challenge and acceptance. And last point, if I may, and on the latest, just to give a concrete example of, for example, how we're looking at it from a financial institution point of view. Because otherwise, we'll just be debating this for eternity. We did actually something very similar to what Shonali mentioned, broken down into 3 compartments: data, modeling, and using it. Data, the usual data governance. I mean, this is nothing new. Modeling, making sure that as much as possible, we are not resulting in any skewness with the models and so forth. But perhaps the most important one to me is the usage, creating safety nets that are able to, as best as possible, and at the very least, highlight, is there any disproportionality happening? Is there any type of gravity to certain type of demographics or representations or attributes that would make us feel uncomfortable? And uncomfortable is, remember, it's not about discrimination. Discrimination is actually not a negative word. If you look at English, it actually means a gentleman of discerning nature. It is the fact that ones that we're not comfortable with, like insurance, we're comfortable to discriminate based on age. If you're younger than 26, you are discriminated against. But we're not comfortable when it comes to gender. Again, I'm not saying about right or wrong, but it's things that from a culture and a society point of view, we need to kind of find where and how we can navigate around it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, Manuel, I know that the last time we were discussing this, you had like a few examples or frameworks to share with people, and getting a lot of questions around those areas as well. Have you seen this work really well in certain scenarios where you feel like, hey, we are doing a good job? Or is there how David broke it down, that there's data, there's modeling, and there's usage? Is there another area you feel that we got to be thinking about in these lines?
Yeah, but maybe before getting to answer that question, I would like to build up a little bit more on David's and Shonali's comment. I think it's clear that right now we are somehow at a crossroads, right? There was big hype and boom of AI, and there was like big promises that everybody's waiting still for, and see how this technology is going to change the way we do banking and all financial services. And then we're seeing is that actually there's some roadblocks there. There's some things that have to be built before we see all that promise come to being, and some of that, and around that, that's where we start hearing about explainability, fairness, bias, and all those aspects. And I think one of the things that it's happening there is that, for one, what David said, it's new, right? So we just haven't had the time to build all that structure. But the other thing is that it's also fundamentally different the way artificial intelligence solutions operate, especially in financial services. Financial services being these legacy structures that have worked fine for the past 100 and more than that years. So they have their ways of operating, right? And now when you start trying to leverage data, deploying solutions that capture even more data as a goal by itself, right? You just want to capture data so you have more things to leverage and build your AI technology on. So it's changing the way the actual process work. And that's another challenge because, like was mentioned before, yeah, you want to hold AI accountable at least as much as you would a human, right, who is making the decision, right? So in banking, that's important because in banking, we have structures and governance for data, for privacy, for different types of decisions. It exists, risk, compliance. And so in those places, now we have to bring AI into that equation. But there are many other risks that did not exist. What they do now that you have this technology, and I think you understand that when you see how AI changes the processes from the modeling and pipeline perspective, right? AI, it's not static in the way it operates, right? Before, when you were doing advanced analytics in the bank, you would have data coming in, a model churning and churning the data, and then putting an outcome that would help somebody make a decision, right? So it was like a very straight pipeline. Very easy to govern, very easy to regulate, right? You know where the bottlenecks are, and so it's easy to see who is accountable for that, and setting out rules. Now it's slightly different. Now you have all these feedback loops everywhere, right? And all these different moving parts, like third parties, front-end solutions that capture more data. And at every one of those points, there might be a feedback loop, right? So the model takes data in, produces an outcome. The user, whoever that is, interacts with that outcome, generates more data that then feeds into the model again to learn more and more. So now there are many places where you have to set up rules or roles of people who have to be accountable or responsible for checking boxes that all of those ethical, fairness, bias principles are met. So that makes it more complicated, right? Setting up a new structure, new questions, new roles, new responsibilities. That's where I see that's also a big part of the challenge, at least in financial services, right? So how do you build on top of what it already exists, which has been working for the past hundreds of years, right? Different very regulated instances. But then now you have to fill in the new holes that AI is creating when you're trying to deploy that. So that's another challenge. And then and then to maybe answer the question of where we are seeing maybe a more fluid or more I don't want to say efficient, but a more that it's operating better system. Again, going back to maybe aviation and aeronautics, or even going to car manufacturing, right? They've had the time to build up a very robust and comprehensive governance. And now that they are starting to use new techniques, data mining, advanced analytics, machine learning, AI, well, they have more to build on. They have maybe less holes in their process to fill in than we do in banking, maybe.
Yeah.
So I think they are doing slightly better than we are in financial services, but because they have had more time to build robust systems, regulatory bodies and whatnot. But that might be subject to debate. I don't know what the other things, but that would be my analogy and my perspective on that question.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I mean, just to add to what you guys mentioned, right, I'm really seeing that at least in the world of capital markets, wherever we are looking to deploy AI, there is increased amount of focus on understanding how are we going to continue to monitor the output from it. And that building a model and testing it and knowing that it has a certain level of accuracy is just one phase of the work. And there is this entire setup that you need to put in place to ensure that I mean, today my data, I mean, my model might, adhere to what I put as fairness standards, etc. But in order to be in a position to even identify data drifts, I need to be putting in entire, setup and energy to ensure that I'm in a position to track this. Shonali, the same sort of thing with you, and there are a variety of questions which I hope that we can touch upon or start addressing as well, is that are there sort of, ways that people can think about how to drive explainability when you are putting these AI engines out there? I can just throw one example that, somebody in a variety of banks, they've been sharing in forums with me that in order to do this, we come up with two different, type of models, one which is a lot more explainable and the other one which we know is going to drive the type of accuracies or efficacies that we look for. And there's always that other piece which comes in, that when we start looking at having these balanced frameworks, are we then compromising accuracy on the back of wanting it to be explainable, or there's that trade-off which is being perceived. I don't know. Could you throw some light on how are you looking at setting up these frameworks which look to balance both, or are you even seeing this as a problem?
Is definitely a challenge. I mean, it is something that we must do. If I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said that it's not just about a model and a accuracy and a back testing. When you put these things into place, and I think that was a point that Manuel also made, which is that you need to have all the governance frameworks to make sure that this is indeed continuing to behave the way we want it to, make decisions and so on. So, okay, I think the very creative way, one is to have a method which is very explainable, easy to explain, something like logistic regression, which is the simplest of methods, but it's very easy to quickly, go back and say, this is what the features that actually, help to make the decision. The other is to then balance this with having a very sophisticated, maybe an ensemble of methods. I think these are all creative approaches that people are taking, and they're only taking these approaches because on the one hand, I think David mentioned that regulators are now starting to sort of, and I think MA has done a great job by giving us those guidelines and so on, and David was part of putting that together. But what they're trying to do is not inhibit, but let it happen, but with certain governance frameworks and processes in place that hold decisions accountable. So the challenge, I mean, I come to the core question, which is how do you think we should do it? The simple answer is there are many ways of doing it. You outlined a few that people are taking. For me, I think the method that we have taken is that, as a company, we are servicing a certain number of applications, clients, and so on. There is a requirement in those sort of regulated domains to be able to explain some critical factors about how a decision is being arrived at, right? I mean, why is a decision being made? Take the example that I'm most familiar with, which is an health insurance claim, right? Now, if we are to put some safeguards and explainability around this, which we have done, which is why, industry has adopted this solution. The first is to have a very simple safeguard to say that if the machine makes a decision to decline a claim, then that machine's decision cannot be the final decision, no matter how confident it is, right? Such a decision must always go through another round of review. This is a very simple safeguard. Now, going back to the point of explainable, why does it actually say it is to be declined or approved? I think here we have to fall, what we have done is we've fallen back on, what does the industry look for in making this kind of decision? That's why I mentioned very early on context, semantics. So within a particular application, what are the reasons for which human beings make certain decisions? We must understand them. I'm not saying that we just follow that blindly. The AI does make a decision as it would, and it should. That's when you get the best accuracy. But then you add a reasoning layer to try and infer why and this decision has been made. That's why I said I like to separate in the beginning as well the how. It has made a decision. How it has made the decision is because it has a deep mathematical basis for how it reasons about the data and arrives at its conclusion. But once it arrives at the conclusion, we as deployed AI scientists and people who are deploying these things, we find that we need to build a reasoning framework on top of a machine learning model to try and infer the, why did this decision actually come about, and find, data points to support that inference, right? So we've actually built that layer on top of it. That's the approach we've taken. And it works because it's not so simple as just following a set of blind rules. The AI is indeed making the decision, but we add that inference layer. And I think that's been the innovation that we've done.
Is it a big challenge to sort of then say that I need to add so many more components in order for this to be, it just makes your AI production maybe 2x more expensive because you are going to create a variety of different components to explain what it's doing?
Yes, I think it is. That's why I said it depends on the application that you're targeting. If it's a ad recommendation, then maybe you don't need to add this level of explainability. But given that we are in insurance, which is financial services, it is regulated. Insurance claims, have to hold the test of at the end of the day, if a customer comes back and says, why did this happen? There must be a rational explanation that needs to be provided for that customer. So I think that's why it is important to add this. It has taken us a long time to actually get to this point.
Yeah.
And it's a non-trivial explanation because, some things in insurance claims are very simple. A rule which is just says that if you haven't paid your premium, of course, you are not entitled to be, paid your claim. That's a very simple rule. For that, you don't need a lot of overhead. But some are very complex. One of the most complex challenges, and we've had to overcome this, is the challenge between, let's say you have a policy exclusion. Let's say you already had a knee injury. And so they've said that you cannot claim for, the left knee. But when you go to the hospital, they don't talk in terms of knees, right? They will say they did some process, some arthroscopy, blah, blah. So you need to somehow be able to infer. The AI has to infer, and it is inferring. But then the explainability needs to link back to some of these aspects as well. So that's why it is very domain specific. I mean, we have not reached a point where I think we can say that this approach works generally for all systems.
Yeah.
But the class of systems, if one is working in a regulated domain, I think that overhead has to be borne, is today my view.
You know what the real problem is here, interestingly enough, is there's two questions. One is, how much are you willing to pay to prevent harm from happening? It's a very difficult question, but the real problem here is AI is only showing us what's happening all the time. So in a way, now we know what we're maybe previously unconsciously ignoring, but now because of AI, we are consciously ignoring and just say, don't use AI because I don't want to deal with all that requirements of explainability. Because notice something very interesting, and I will bring you back to my FEE principles number, I think it was 14 or 4, I can't remember which one exactly, which says that AI should be held to at least the same level of expectation as humans. Because don't get me wrong, if you want to hold AI to a higher level of standards, sure, no problem. But you kind of have to start with the humans as well. You can't say like, no, AI needs to do this, but you as a human don't need to. That's the definition of double standards.
So interestingly, David, there's a question in this regard. It's like, how do you do that? How do you hold AI accountable, at the same level as a human? Are you trying to blame the creator or person who was writing code? So where does the error sit eventually, and who's legally liable?
So this is where I perhaps may differ on some views that are out there, but and again, this may be a matter of semantics, but I do not hold AI accountable. And there's a reason why I do not hold AI accountable, because my starting fundamental position is I'm not building AI to replace humans. I'm building AI to augment people. That's my starting point. The second is we can't hold AI accountable. I mean, are we going to put AI in a court? We can't. We literally, in any form or shape, can't do it. We don't have the legal system to manage it. So to me, it's not that the human will do better decisions, but at least there is that firing of neurons and hopefully common sense that it may come out as the most probable right decision, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But a person simply says, no, I don't feel that is the right thing. However, one can say that's unexplainable, unjustifiable. So to me, in the end of the day, and it is complex, as Manuel was describing earlier in terms of the loops and all that, there is a necessity of having an overlay that in the end of the day, there is a person who's accountable, or equally, by the way, so let's say you're dealing with a vendor, and a vendor, and by the way, this is the definition of a black box to me, says, here, and trust me, this will work awesomely. No, I mean, when I get sued, I'm going to have a back-to-back against you in terms of I'm going to hold you accountable. And by the way, this is exactly what happens. And if you think about it, insurance has effectively kind of solved the whole problem of self-driving vehicles. They don't hold the car accountable. They will hold someone in that process, be it from a manufacturing point of view, just like we manufacture things now. So it's not that we can't do it. And in fact, this is the fascinating thing about AI. Despite it being so new, we're constantly trying to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to. We have these processes. Petrochemicals, we have mechanisms of dealing with the combustants and the potential risks that may come from that. Transportation, aviation, people. So I always say that, don't get me wrong, we want to push the boundaries, we want to go there, but let's start simple. Let's start pragmatic, and let's operationalize AI. That's my catchphrase for the last 2 years, operationalizing AI, because otherwise, we will be constantly visioning this wonderful mirage, but never, ever, ever get there, because there will always something that's stopping us, ourselves, our trust, or because accidents happen. And that's my final point I want to say about accountability. We need to also be conscious that mistakes will happen. AI and the people along the way will do things wrong. But there's a very big difference in saying, I am putting safeguards, I am putting controls, and when things go wrong, I will hold myself accountable, apologize, hopefully, and fix it, in the sense of like, which happened to us, was it when they had that market crash due to an algorithmic going wild, saying like, oh, we didn't know it was the algorithm. I mean, please.
Yeah, I worry that, people, given that people are still going to be held accountable, they are going to continue to have more demands from their data scientists.
But people are held accountable now. That's my point. There's no difference per se. Yeah. The only difference now is right now, you're coming up with those numbers in your head or through an Excel sheet or a process, which, by the way, how many people truly can explain how the credit scoring decision has been arrived at?
Yeah.
It was a bunch of smart men and women sitting in a room and going, we think that's a good way of going. Now explain that to me in detail.
Well, I spent 10 years in credit, so I'm not going to get started on that. But I'm getting conscious of time. I do want to tackle a few questions as well. And Manuel, I was wondering if you could help tackle this, or start with it at least. Somebody's asking about, so what are the main challenges that you have practically faced in trying to drive explainability in your world? I mean, are there examples that you can say that this did not work, or this indeed is something which we tried and we know now that this is not the way to go, and potentially this is? There are also some questions around, being in a position to figure out whether logistic regressions or tree-based models or, CNN or RNN and, those type of things. But just wanted for you to just help unfold the challenge piece, and if you were also in a position to throw some light on a little bit deeper modeling level piece that might help address a couple of questions.
Yeah, well, in terms of challenges, I think, and that comes back to my previous intervention, the bigger the challenge becomes when you are navigating in waters where there's not much governance there to begin with. Like, for instance, when we were maybe working on solutions for setting up new credit scoring mechanisms, that wasn't that complicated because the structure was there. All we were doing was, like David was saying, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? And we do not want to replace humans. We just want to augment them, right? So whatever model we would come up with, you would always set it up in a way that it's helping somebody somewhere make a decision. And so that person is still accountable for whatever outcome follows, just as it was before, there was a very sophisticated model assisting with the decision, right? So we didn't have much trouble. Of course, it's easier said than done, but when there was things already there, right? But then the thing becomes more complicated when you are trying to change a certain process and you're coming up with a new moving part somewhere for which you have to come up with the governance process as well as the solution, right? For instance, whenever you wanna transform completely the way an institution works through data, so make it more data-centric or data-driven, that means starting to think differently when you deploy applications, when you do solutions through which the clients are going to interact, right? Because now your objective is to capture more data, and that all of a sudden makes it a little bit tricky, because when you start thinking about, okay, now that I'm collecting all the data, I want to maybe understand better my clients or the population so that I can make better marketing campaigns, or so that I can do some cross-selling more efficiently, then you start thinking of very different ways in which you can tap on all those data channels that now you're collecting and leverage that information, right? But then that makes the data governance, data privacy maybe more challenging, because then all of a sudden you do not have the structure for data privacy and data collecting consent, because the data that you were collecting was collected in a different framework under different set of consent rules.
Right.
So the challenges that we faced was when we were trying to do maybe those kind of things, right? So now we want to make more efficient or more powerful some of our predicting, forecasting tools that would use other types of data that were not used before. Because then you do not know. There are questions like, if you do that, do we have the right to do it? Do we have the compliance, the consent to do that? Or are we sure that we're not introducing biases when we do that, because this is different types of data that we're not using before? So those were more challenging, and there are still more challenging applications, right? When you're doing something where there's not enough structure to begin with.
Brilliant. I mean, I don't know where the hour has passed, but I can keep going on discussing with you guys what we could be doing, and it could be another hour easily. But it's been a fascinating discussion, and I have a lot of walkaways for myself, in the fact that there's a lot more attention to be paid in how we monitor systems after we have built them, to sort of keep that going. David, I love that, looking at explainability by breaking it down between the data, the modeling, and the usage. I probably would add another piece to it, which we've been working on, is also looking at the team and how diverse it is, to be in a position to identify the bias so that you know that that is also being taken care of, because sometimes we just forget that, you know, we put in one-dimensional team who will not even be in a position to stop that. But just quickly, you know, 30 seconds each, any last sort of parting advice to everybody as a good sign-off? Who wants to kick off? Janali?
Okay. Well, first of all, I've really enjoyed being here. You're right. I don't know where the hour went. Thank you so much, Ayla, David, Manuel. It's really been fascinating for me talking to all of you. I've enjoyed it. I think the final point that I want to make is that, you know, the true explainability of AI, I think that's a domain of research. I think a pathway to that is to feed or develop algorithms which can learn from both data and context. Because the more context it has, then such systems can become more explainable. But I think that's a fair way away. And I think for today, the two things which I really liked hearing from all our panelists, one is that it's more than just a model. What you know, Sanjana was saying, that we need to actually look at how we basically you know, look at putting the whole system into place and monitor these systems. And David's point that, you know, it's about holding it accountable to the degree that we hold human beings accountable, and actually not more than that. I think those were two key takeaways for me from this discussion. Thank you so much, Sanjana. Thanks, David.
Thanks,
And
thanks. Manuel?
Yeah, well, thanks, everybody. Nice to see you. So again, so yeah, so maybe the one thing I would say is for those technical people out there in the audience, like data scientists or people doing machine learning, explainability, there are many challenges around what we understand as under explainability, right? There is policy challenges, there is governance challenges, but there is also the component of a technical challenge, right? Because every time somebody in a different context asks a question, when you go back the series of moving parts, then you always end up with a technical question, right? How can you make your model and add a layer of explainability layer that is satisfactory for that particular context? And that's a technical challenge. So that's like Shonali mentioned, that's still an area of research. And it depends much on who is asking the question and why, but that translates into an interesting technical question. So there are many room for research in that area. So maybe those who are more technical profile might find it interesting to go in that direction. Thank you.
I'll just say, look, thank you very much. And it's always great catching up with everyone again. I guess the thanks of the digital aspect of things now. I'll just say two points. One is, with great power comes great responsibility, maybe in theme of what I have in the background. And the second one is not to be disincentivized because of governance and because of these. Absolutely not. Good governance breeds phenomenal innovation, and it's really about that. Because in the end of the day, I always say there's two questions about AI. Can you do it, and should you do it? The answer for can is almost always yes. Should, maybe not always, or maybe slightly in different contexts. So that's my parting 30 seconds.
Thanks, David. Brilliant. Thank you, guys. I hope you had an engaging session and are also in a position to walk away with a few things that you're going to bring back in, you know, the AI applications that you look to or are ongoingly building. Thanks, SG Innovate, for having really created this sort of a discussion, a very pertinent topic. It's amazing how you guys have set up this community, which is so engaged. I wish we could answer every question, but that's potentially for another session. So back to you, Jinsam.
Yeah, thank you, Sashna, and thank you to our panel of speakers for the great sharing, and thank you to everyone who's attending our session and for your ongoing questions. It's always heartening to see so much enthusiasm at our online sessions, but real conversations often happen after, so we do hope that all of you can keep connected. The recording of this session will also be uploaded on SG Innovate's YouTube channel, so do subscribe and head on there for a review of today's event and to our next online event. So bye, everyone.
And one last thing, Sanjana, I think it's really hard to moderate online. You've done a phenomenal job of, I think, keeping all of us in check and not letting it get away.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sanjana. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Sorry.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you for
Bye.
joining us. And good night, Manuel.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
You're the explain to me that.
Bye.